Okay, this is a bit of an experiment. Me reading my own story. Um, I'll read a little bit of it just to introduce it, but then I'm going to have this Mr. Electronic guy read it because he'll do a much better job than me. But, anyways, this is my story about the Seamroig. The Seamroig is the shamrock in Gaelic, ancient Ireland. And given that we're all cousins and we know this, that our first settlement in the New World was called the Shamrock. Pretty interesting, right? So I decided to make a story about this. And this is the intro of them coming off the ship, in particular, Patrick Kelly, and his first accounts of seeing Bytown. That was the name of the first town after they got off Gross Island, is Bytown. So I'm going to click on this guy and let him read, and then we'll go from there. Again, this is completely made up. It's fiction. There's reasons why I'm putting it to fiction to make it a little bit more real. It's just pure speculation, but I'll explain later why I chose this format. Okay, so let me pause this. Okay, let me put this on. It's a reader, and he's much more clear and cohesive than I am, so I'm gonna let this program read it for me.
The Seamroig. Bytown? Patrick saw the orphan on the docks of Bytown, and a river of emotions cascaded over him. It was unanticipated and oddly refreshing. He adjusted his hat and stopped before heading towards the boy. Taking in the long view, he inhaled and said, "So this is Bytown." The romantic West he had been reading about. The Americas, freedom, liberty and hope, it was all too real. "Not much of a stone's throw from Galway now, is it?" he muttered as an Irishman. "What kind of place is this?" Pondering the 47 days spent crossing the Atlantic, he wasn't getting God's joke. He sharpened his attention, his emerald green eyes sparkled, and he was firm. He felt human again, having been numb for years, saying nothing about losing his family farm, business, wife, and family. The whole lot of it. He would say and gesture as if it was the biblical flood. Then, most recently, the ordeal in crossing to the Americas, more precisely to Canada. Patrick was a long shot better than most. He had paid his way and had a solid and very reputable employer waiting, that being J.D. Booth and Company. Patrick travelled above deck and felt guilty that so many poor travelled as human ballast. If there were more passengers, he would have been broke before arriving on the shores of Canada. But, as it stood, there were only 58, and nearly half of the passengers needed no help. So yes, they all endured the endless potatoes with some fish, beans, and salt pork here and there. The Trinity mainly had unloaded the motley crew of passengers from Grosse Isle immigration facilities at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River at Quebec. The passengers were still numb from being on the boat for 47 days but very relieved. Taking in the Canadian oxygen and hope, although it all was heavenly, it was still freedom despite the oppression, struggles they would indeed find. Anything would be easier than what they had already overcome. It was, by far, nothing like what was to come in 45 and last through 52. In contrast to all the commotion, Patrick saw a boy who stood out in perfect form and style from the crowd. Most peculiar, he was alone and of solid stock. He was well taken care of, except now neglected and abandoned. Most strikingly, there was a courageous truth about him. This glistened in Patrick's emerald green Seamroig's eyes, answering for himself. He had survived the ship crossing the Atlantic. Oddly, he passed through Grosse Island nearly effortlessly. The truth, Morgan mate answered for him, and that he was being sent on to the family in Horton. But Owen had no such direction and was simply sent free by the young sailor who knew he would manage well by himself. It turns out, Owen was a bastard child, an orphan left to the sailor and the sea. Neither French, British proper, nor Irish, he was Welsh of all things. Part French and Carib Indian of Saint Martinique. Even so, fairer and angelic. His father was a merchant marine who traversed the oceans and navies of the day, now truly left to the sea and wilderness. His father, the sailor, had died in crossing. Sadly, no one seemed to notice, but Patrick. Patrick was an Irish blacksmith, and a member of the Danans, a blacksmiths' association, in his 40s contracted by J.R. Booth for the lumber camps northwest Bytown. Patrick was particular and obsessive in an Irishman's way. He wasn't looking forward to training apprentices. For him, it was harder than bending and shaping iron, and quite frankly, it had been a disaster for him. This includes his wife, children, and family. He was more alone than the child and thus, immediately identified with him. He would share his whiskey with him, but he was too young. Patrick approached the boy smoking his pipe. Between puffs, he casually inquires with his charming Irishman's voice, suggesting the big journey. "What's your name, lad?" The boy took a moment to register and translate Patrick's thick Limerick accent. Charmed and curious, the boy turned toward Patrick, and he must have been 8 or so. His gold lock glowed, and his bright blue eyes opened for a moment, then stained to see Patrick standing over him in the bright Canadian early autumn light. He said with a queer soft but seen quizzical voice, "Owen." He said like an owl. Patrick, surprised and delighted. "A Welshman, I see." Owen captured the compliment and humour. It was clear Patrick thought that was fitting and perfect. Taking a drag on his pipe, he liked Owen's brand. Patrick addressed him as a businessman out of respect, and Owen smiled. He felt comfortable. Patrick melodically made his offer to the boy in proper Limerick businessman style. "I'm headed northwest into the forests. I could use a helping hand," and he gestures as if he's an older man looking at his blacksmith gear. It all made sense to Owen. He smiled, and Patrick said, "Good then," and said, "We are a team with conviction." As children always do, Owen didn't pause and adapted to Patrick right away. Patrick didn't know, nor did Owen, for that matter. Owen was partially raised Welsh by his Welsh uncle Morgan. For some reason, Patrick was sure it was because he was a sailor and never confident of Owen's future. He did not tell him. He was a friend of the family, that is all. It did not make sense. Patrick figured it was because of his uncertainties, and he could relate to that. Owen was the child of a teenage liaison between the Governor Farankdile du Parquet of L'Etoile Ilit's Saint Martinique daughter and that of Morganage cousin Jock. They kept the affair as quiet as possible, but in haste. Morgan took Owen planning on finding a suitable home which he tried and failed more than once and decided it was best to keep him by his side and watchful eye. He considered returning him to Jack Knott. He fears Jack was a thief, and time proved him right. He was hung for piracy and had to watch in horror in attendance. Morgan loved Owen and would settle for nothing less for him. He never told him the whole truth about his father, just heroic tales of all sorts. Owen had the same captivating charm for Patrick, and quite often, he thought of the Seamroig in Owen but dismissed it as a fanciful daydream. Patrick dreamt of a true son other than Martin. Martin was too straight-laced, proper, and went with his fanatical God-fearing mother. Helen Bridget was beautiful and the perfect Irish bride, but not for Patrick Kelly by a long shot. She was stern and deeply religious, which meant more than being very Victorian. It meant being excessively rigid, and more curiously, very superstitious in a very Irish way, which means having roots in medieval superstition which traces back to ancient Ireland. No, Catholicism did not eradicate the Irish identity and heritage, nor did the countless conquers and influences, including the Vikings, Normans, and English. Most peculiar and most sad, Helen Bridget represents many Irish women who did not fare as well as the men by a long shot. They tended to be sullen and susceptible to countless mental health conditions. The Irish men gained freedom via warfare, trades, religion when not tied to their farms and families. Helen Bridget was the typical Victorian Irish woman with fair white skin, light brown hair, hazel eyes, somewhat small and slender, and the Irish crooked cross, sad grimace and a nervous smile. On the Bytown main dock, Patrick looked around as if he were Rip Van Winkle. Time had caught up with him, and he opened his mouth as if his thoughts were suddenly stolen. He looked around, and the dock had cleared except for the two of them. The docks were made of large seasoned Canadian timber, the typical British Navy, and designed for utility. The Ottawa River ordered berth, port, and warehouse. The docks were relatively new, meaning a decade or two, primarily for commercial uses with generous merchant access, most notably the Dutch East Indian Company and many worn French industry. The town of Bytown was a medley of French-English 19th century styles with Royal Navy practicality. As with any foreign outpost, the typical amenities, mercantile stores, brothels, barracks, hotels, and saloons. As for Patrick standing alone in his suit and top hat and Owen by his side, Owen watched him like an owl, but otherwise, the Ottawa River ordered berth, port, and warehouse no one noticed or cared. Patrick gathered himself and said like an official policeman, "Your possessions, where are they?" With a searching look, which communicated with Owen. Owen pointed to the steamer named Trinity. Patrick turned and saw the sailors washing the decks. The water was flowing off the sides as they washed. Owen sauntered to a large Prussian blue woolen seaman's winter jacket and Russian fur cap, lifting them off of a box of rotten potatoes. It was just in time. Two sailors lifted the box, tipping it and tossing the potatoes into the harbour, mixing with the harbour filth. Patrick looked at the loading ramp and saw the second mate. Approached him with Owen in tow and declared, "This is Sailor Morgan's boy. I've come for his belongings." The first mate whistled and yelled to the labouring sailors, "Can you fetch Morgan's belongings?" A knowing sailor gave the sign of overboard with a thumbs down over the side of the ship. It was a partial lie. Patrick knew it. They had plundered his belongings, no doubt. Patrick wasted no emotion, tilted his head slightly like Sherlock Holmes' gestures that the baboons never ceased to amaze him. He froze for a moment and gathered his resolve. He looked to Owen, "Let's fetch my belongings. Then I'll tend to you." Patrick walked briskly over to the Liberty 100 yards away, claimed his two chests, then signaled for the last porter who was waiting for them. The larger bear-like métis, that is mixed race, put the belongings in the wagon, then Patrick said, "Take me to the mercantile." Patrick looked over to the striking young man and said, "Are you Moore?" He wasn't sure what Patrick was asking but assumed he was asking for his name. With a thick Cajun accent. "Jess, am Frenchy Fork," he declared proudly. Patrick would learn and was an Iroquois brave and part Jesuit-raised French. Frenchy had the energy Patrick liked, much like the Seamroig, but foreign.
Okay, that's plenty for now. Anyways, I can relate to this, in fact, because my many trips up into Canada and to the Northwest Territories and so forth, we spent a lot of time on fishing docks and so forth, and I really had that feel in myself where you're smelling these new pine trees, the oxygen, the water, the new people. So that basically painted the background in my head for this story. So this story is kind of a medley of many different things, and in a way, I'm kind of like Patrick. I gotta choose somebody, so it might as well be me, because I'm ambidextrous like my grandfather, who was a blacksmith, and I'm guessing maybe Patrick was too. That'd be a very useful skill for the logging camps where they're headed. There's much more to this, but I'm gonna cut it for now.